and welcome. This is a full review of the Eurorack module ηCarinae version 2. ηCarinae is an analog voltage controlled oscillator with a fully analog architecture that has 5 basic waveforms and white noise. All waveforms have dedicated classic individual outputs, and each waveform can be individually shaped. In this review, we'll also be using the first version of ηCarinae, located to the right. I put a lot of effort into making this VCO as versatile and flexible as possible, both for tonal applications and for sound design exploration. The core idea behind the model is to enable multi-layered synthesis using simple basic waveforms, allowing the creation of more complex and interesting timbres through a purely analog design. For this purpose, we have the main output called ηOut. Now I'll try to quickly demonstrate the core concept and features of the model, as well as how many levels of interaction are available for shaping timbres. The first level is waveform selection. We can choose a specific waveform. The second level allows us to alter the shape of that basic waveform. The third level introduces the Sine plus mode, where any select waveform is summed with a modified sine wave. The fourth level is SUB oscillators. We can choose whether the SUB is divided by 2 or 4 or mix between them, which already gives us a much more complex signal. The fifth level is frequency or phase modulation. We can use an external oscillator, for example, to further enrich the sound. The sixth level is self-patching. For instance, we can take the sine wave output and feedback into the waveform mix control, and as the sign changes, the timbres will shift significantly. We'll go over all of this and more in detail now. Now let's take a quick look at the control elements. The first knob is the octave selector, which allows you to set the frequency in octave steps. There are 12 positions in total, 2 of which are low frequency modes. A quick note, these are not full modes. The minimum frequency is around 1.5 Hz, which will be discussed in more detail in the modulation section of this review. Next is the fine-tune knob for precise frequency adjustment. The following knob controls the basic waveform mixture. It goes through triangle to sine wave, saw, double saw, square wave pulse width modulation. At minimum the pulse width is 100%, and it narrows as you turn the knob. And white noise with a vactrol based low pass filter, which has its own short release time. To recap, this knob selects the waveform, while this one shapes the waveform. Next, this trimmer controls the SUB oscillator level in the main mix. Then, a fine balance trimmer adjusts the ratio between the two SUB signals, 2 or 4. Phase trimmer is a modulation signal attenuator. The first button turns the sine plus mode on or off. The second button switches between hard and soft sync types. Now let's talk about the connectors and their colors. All red connectors are voltage controllable inputs. Each connector controls a specific function. This one controls waveform selection. This one controls PWM shape function, or PWMs. This one adjusts the amplitude of the SUB oscillator signal in the main mix. This is a 1 volt per octave input. This is a synchronization input. And this one is a modulation input. All over 6 jacks are outputs. We have 5 individual waveform outputs. This triangle and sun, saw, double saw, square with PWM, and white noise. The most important output is eta out. This output carries the result of the module's full synthesis engine. You can either take a complex blended signal like this one, or isolate a specific waveform, but it will still respond to a PWMs function. Each output connector is color-coded individually. Also, as many of you know and love, we have touchpads. There are 2. The lower one controls waveform selection. The upper one controls PWMs shaping function. Now let's take a closer look at how morphing works for each waveform. First, the triangle wave. When you add PWMs, it gradually morphs into a sine wave and then starts folding. It does this twice and then begins to emphasize the peaks of the fundamental frequency. Next is a saw wave. Under the influence of the PWMs function, it smoothly morphs into a skewed triangle wave and then rotates back in the opposite direction, essentially from rising saw to falling saw. The same applies to the double saw. Then comes the square wave, which has standard pulse width modulation. It changes the duty cycle accordingly. The white noise is pure white noise, but it passes through a vactrol-based low-pass filter. Because of the vactrol's natural decay, the signal doesn't close immediately, giving a short release, which makes it great for things like hi-hat synthesis. Sine plus mod. Here's how it works. We have a saw wave, doesn't matter what waveform we select. When you press the sine plus button, a processed sine wave is added to the current signal. As you can see, the waveform gets rounded. that's the sine being added. And when you start changing the PVM's function, the timbre begins to change in a complex way. As you can see, the result of combining with the bifolded sine is much more intricate. It all morphs smoothly and creates a very complex rounded timbre. You can do the same with any other waveform. With sine plus enable, a sine wave is also blended into the noise signal. Let's try to modulate the mixer and PVM's function, first separately, then together, using various LFO signals. Now let's talk about the SUB oscillators. The SUB oscillators generate signals an octave down, divide by 2, and 2 octaves down, divide by 4 from the base frequency. You can control the amplitude of the SUB oscillator signal in the main mix using control voltage. Let's plug in an LFO here. Now let's discuss synchronization. This model can be usually synced to another oscillator. The best way is to use square wave from another oscillator and feed it into the sync input. Here's hard sync, now soft sync. Soft again and back to hard sync. Our model now includes the ability to configure and switch between various types of modulation. On the back panel there's a jumper matrix that allows you to select the desired modulation type. By default, the setting is TZFM through zero frequency modulation, but you can also switch to TZPM through zero phase modulation, exponential or linear, although the linear mode behaves slightly differently. Essentially, it provides an additional form of direct linear control via the FM input. And as a small bonus, there's also remodulation. Let's now go through the different modulation types and hear how they sound. Right now the model is set to TZFM. We're using two VCOs tuned to roughly the same frequency. ηCarinae version 1 is modulating ηCarinae version 2, and we're listening to the output from ηCarinae version 2. Both oscillators are set to sine waves and are tuned nearly identically. As we increase the modulation depth, you'll notice that while the waveform cycles remain consistent, new details emerge between them. This is the essence of TZFM. The oscillator doesn't stop when it receives negative modulation voltage. It continues reversing its direction. If we change the modulating oscillator's frequency, it's not very interesting. But if we change the frequency on the modulated oscillator, it creates the impression that we're modulating the modulator, leading to deeper modulation effects. This is often compared to wavefolding. The base frequency stays is the same, but we introduce new sidebands, resulting in richer content. It's not exactly the same process, but psychoacoustically it's perceived in a similar way. Now let's switch to TZPM. Here's how the jumper configuration looks for that. What's the difference between TZPM and TZFM? In TZPM, the DC offset of the modulating signal is completely removed. This means that even if the modulation signal has imbalanced in amplitude, it won't disturb the bass pitch of the VCO as much. Initially, phase modulation might sound less dramatic, especially with continuous modulation in the audio range. But just like in TZFM, modulating the carrier's frequency creates rich sidebands and potential folding. The main benefits of TZPM: it's more stable. It automatically removes direct current from the modulation signal. To demonstrate, let's now send a positive DC voltage to the modulation input. You hear the oscillator pitch rise at first, but then it corrects itself and settles back to the base frequency. However, this means that very low frequency modulation or DC sources won't have much effect, or could result in distorted modulation. Let's now move to the exponential modulation type by switching this jumper. With this mode, you'll hear fewer harmonic changes and longer pauses between waveform cycles. Even at high frequencies, you'll notice gaps in the waveform. This type of modulation is essentially equivalent to modulating the oscillator via the 1 volt per octave input. Bonus: the 7th level of sound shaping, ring modulation. Now let's configure the jumpers for ring mode only. Everything else stays the same. And we get to know ring modulation. What's special about this mode is that it layers onto the base waveform, simply summing with the output, and appears only in the eta out mix. You can adjust its amplitude using a dedicated trimmer. Right now we have a standard sine wave with a ring modulated signal layered on top. To isolate only the ring modulation, set the PVM as knob to minimum, select white noise as the base waveform, and you'll get a pure ring modulated signal. When the modulating amplitude is 0, ring modulation disappears, and so does the signal. This mode can be used with any base waveform. It adds a tonal character to tonal sources. And as a final bonus, you can combine ring modulation with any other type of frequency modulation. Just set the jumper like this. Now you have both TZFM and ring modulation active. This produced new additional tonal textures while retaining the original FM timbre. You can mix and match to your taste and explore a wide range of sonic possibilities. LFO. How to drop the frequency lower than the octave selector allows. Let's adjust the time span. Under the standard setting, the lower frequency is around 1.5 Hz. But if you need to go even lower, it's easy. Just take a negative constant voltage from anywhere, feed it into the FM input, and by adjusting the modulation depth, you can lower the oscillator's frequency even further. In this section, we'll jam a bit with the model, starting from simple patches and moving toward more complex ones, demonstrating some typical applications for this VCO. I've already wrote the model's mixed output into a filter, which is controlled by an envelope generator, and the gate and 1 volt per octave signals come from the kStep. Let's start with a moderately slow arpeggio. As you can hear, we're getting basic sounds, without any external modulation. Now let's try adding random LFO modulation. let's take a look at another interesting patch that can be created with this module, a kind of organ-like weird patch. I'll disable the additional modulation for now. Since we have double throw, we can add SUB oscillators, resulting in 4 octaves sounding simultaneously. With Sine plus mode enabled, which includes waveforming, we effectively get a 5th pseudo-octave. Can also try using modulated PVM to make it even richer. And that's where the real power of this device shines. Now let's make this complex signal even more massive. Well, take the sine output and for example use it to modulate the waveform mixer. We also have the noise component, and what's interesting is that self-patching behaves differently depending on the waveform and the patch point. Noise in this case will simply act as a textural layer. We can also send the signal into the SUB input and slightly attenuate it. That also creates very interesting results. All of these rich timbral textures are built from simple waveforms, and more importantly, from analog and organic sources. Let's now try something more abstract, a sound design focused drone. Well, just open up the filter and let it breathe. As I mentioned earlier, this model is extremely versatile and works equally well for creating noisy or experimental textures.